This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Off the Page. You were just listening to the overture from King Arthur, an opera written in 1691 by Henry Purcell, probably the greatest English composer of the Baroque period. I played it as a little warm-up for our topic today, life in early modern Europe around the year 1700. Now, before we get into this episode, let me take a moment to introduce myself and this podcast, History Off the Page. My name is Dr. Jason Hansen, and I'm an associate professor of modern European history at Furman University. I started History Off the Page to be a sort of virtual textbook for people on the go who want to learn more about European history. And to make a long story short, basically for many years I did the typical professor thing, where I assigned these massive textbooks that are full of images, full of documents, several hundred pages, that also happen to cost more than $100. Or maybe you can rent them. You get them for like $70, $60, but then you lose access to them once the semester's over. And I found this was a really poor way of trying to teach history. For one thing, many of the students don't actually read the textbooks anymore. Our habits on how we consume information have changed over the last 10, 20 years, right? We don't read as much as we once did. So I tried to cut down on that. I tried using skinnier volumes, and I found that they really didn't get any detail or depth. People didn't understand some of the more important developments going on in European history. So in the end, I decided to create this podcast because it solves so many of these problems. It's free, it's portable, and it's accessible to really anyone who wants to learn more about European history, right? It's not just for college students anymore. So whether you're a student in college or in high school, an adult getting ready to travel to Europe, or someone who's just interested in learning while you're on a long car trip, History Off the Page will be just right for you. The podcast is organized into a series of courses such as the one you've just started, An Introduction to Modern Europe. Each course is broken down into a separate episode built around a particular theme. And over the course of the next 30 episodes, we'll cover a variety of topics, some that you would normally find in a textbook on major events like the French Revolution, industrialization. Everyone, of course, always wants to know more about the world wars. But we're also going to talk here about culture. We're going to answer questions like, what did it feel like to live in a European city in 1840? What did it smell like? What did it taste like? Why are Vincent van Gogh's paintings so special and valuable? And one of my favorite topics, how is it that Elvis Presley helped America win the Cold War? So this podcast will be informative, but it's also going to be fun and entertaining as well. It's not your traditional history podcast. We're not focused on memorizing lots of names and dates. I think here often of the clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where the comedian Ben Stein is kind of reading off all of this dry history about FDR and tariff policy in the 1930s. If you've seen the movie, he goes, "Does anyone know the answer? Anyone? Anyone? It was the anyone? Right, and all the students are falling asleep and they're all drooling and everything like that. That's not what we want to do here on this podcast. We want to have fun. We want to learn. And I think you're going to enjoy it as we move through the various topics. Now, if you're really curious about European history, we'll also have a second level of more specific episodes available via Patreon. And these will be about things like the rise of urban planning, the birth of modern sports, and a short history of terrorism. You can find out more about the general course overview on our website, historyoffthepage.com. But enough about that. We start our course today with an episode entitled A World of Tradition, A World of Change. And this will basically provide us with a brief overview of what life was like in Europe around 1600 to 1700. And we pick this date as a sort of starting point for modern European history because it's this really amazing moment when you have a world that largely existed as it had been for 1,000 years. But at the same time, we also have these fundamental changes taking place. And we pick this date as a start of modern European history because it's this fascinating moment when Europe had looked largely the same as it had for the last 1,000 years. Now, don't get me wrong, medieval history is very important. We can go into much more detail about that. There are some phenomenally important changes going on in medieval society. But for the most part, if you took somebody out of the year, let's say 1650, and you plunked them down in the year 850, a lot of the things, a lot of the culture, a lot of society, a lot of economics, politics, that world would have looked somewhat familiar to them. Now, at the same time that we're talking about this tremendous period of constancy, we're also seeing around the year 1600, 1650, 1700, we're starting to see these tremendous changes. Not just in terms of one government or another government, or even a style of government, but in the very way that Europeans begin to think about their place in the world that they live in the way that they begin to think about social and economic organization. There are really radical and profound transformations that are going on in this kind of period. And so that's why we as historians, we said this is the birth of the modern world. It really starts in this kind of early modern period, right around 1600, around 1700. So it's both a world of tradition and of change. Now, rather than starting our podcast off today with kind of dry recounting of facts, and here is France, and here's the Austrian Empire, here is Spain, I want to start by just making some very broad observations about what the world looked like to these people, again, around the year 1600, 1700. Kind of depends on the place you're at, when some of these changes are more felt than others. So the first observation that I want to make is that we're talking here about a world of tradition. Now, of course, all societies have traditions, right? We all have our traditions. We all think, okay, it's Saturday afternoon. This is what I'm going to do before college football starts. I have my rituals. When I say the idea that this was a world of tradition, it was a world where people did not expect or even necessarily desire change. The idea of progress was not something that they would have understood, or most of them would have understood, in the way that you and I do today. Right? We think about change not even as something that, well, do we want change or do we not want change, but it's something that's inevitable. The idea that the future will look different than it does today is something that we have generally just accepted. Think about any movie that deals with the future or TV show, right? It's never looking just like today. Or if I said, okay, we're setting this film and it's set in the year 2500, but the stuff going on, you can't just have them walking into offices and they're still using smartphones, right? They have to be able to just project data onto glasses, or maybe they've got an implant in their brains. Maybe think about some of the classical movies, right? Star Wars, right? Oh, of course we can go light speed in the future. Star Trek, of course we can beam people into different planets and we've got phasers instead of guns. Star Wars, of course, they have lasers, which of course brings up an interesting question to me is, why do stormtroopers wear armor? You notice in the movies, they're always getting shot with the lasers and it doesn't help them. So why are they wearing armor? I guess in the future, they didn't think about that one. All right, but the point is that you are so used to the idea of constant change that you don't really even think about it anymore. If you want a more local kind of example, think about the phone that you use. How many of you are still using flip phones? How many of you are okay with a phone that isn't a smartphone? How many of you expect to use the same model of phone that you have now 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Are you one of those people that has to have the latest iPhone, right? You're going to line up the night before just to make sure that you get the latest iPhone 17, 18, whatever it is, right? But we always have to have the newest thing because we expect that the newest thing is better, more powerful, faster, stronger than whatever existed before. We believe, we expect change to be constant. People living in the early modern period, people living around 1700, do not expect this sense of change. When they think about the future, they expect it to look basically like it does in the present. To put this another way, Europe in the early modern period is a world of stasis, or it's supposed to be a world of stasis, right? That's the expectation that people have. Okay, second observation is that we're talking here about a feudal world. Now, when I say feudal world, what do you think about? If I say feudalism, isn't the first thought that comes to mind some kind of knight, knight errant, and he's on horseback and he's riding around? Do you think about kings and queens? Do you think about being at like a Renaissance fair? We kind of have this image of feudalism baked into our brains, right? The idea of lords and vassals and chivalry and obligation. Really great example of that is the show Game of Thrones, massively popular on HBO from about 2010 to 2018, 2019. Everybody knew when they started talking about lords and vassals and squires. Everybody kind of understood that. You didn't have to have someone explain it. This notion of feudalism, obviously being with knights and lords and ladies and things like that, it is based in some historical experience. But let's explore this just a little bit more to get at what feudalism was and what it's evolved into by the time that we're in the 1600s. Basically, feudalism begins as an ad hoc system of defense. Or if you go back to the 8th century, the 9th century, when it really first begins to emerge in France, one of the problems that you face is defending against the Vikings. Right? The Vikings are there in their longships. The Vikings know how to sail into the wind. And so the Vikings just kind of show up at various places. They've also got very good intelligence, by the way. So they know exactly when everybody's going to be in a town on a particular feast day. They know when the relics are going to be out. And they just kind of show up and they strike. And you don't have a modern army to defend against it. Right? If a barbarian tribe just showed up at your door, you said, okay, well, I've got some swords here, maybe some axes. But you're probably not going to win that fight. To do a real fight in the early medieval period, the king has to assemble an army. He's got to contact all the various lords and say, okay, you've got horses, let's all get together. It takes a long time to be able to marshal that kind of force. In fact, they really have seasons that they do this because they know that they can't afford to do it constantly. You don't have that ability to react. So feudalism starts as this ad hoc system of defense whereby a powerful lord or kind of warrior who becomes the king says, look, I own this land. I will give this land to my vassal. And in exchange for that, they promise to give me military service when I call for it. So because the vassals have land, they have wealth, and they can use that wealth then to maintain horses, which makes them better fighters in combat. So initially, this kind of starts out like a deal. I give you some land, you give me service. And then that vassal then says, well, I've got more land than I can use. I'm going to do the same thing. And so I give that land to someone, they promise service to me, and so you move on down the sort of social ladder. So this is what feudalism looks like in the 8th century. Over the course of time, these relationships, these deals that people are making, become hereditary. The King of France says, well, the Duke of Brittany, we've had these relationships for several generations now, feel like I can trust you. Let's make this deal in perpetuity. Over the course of time, the military value of feudalism begins to decline. In the High Middle Ages, about the year 1000 to like 1100, feudal relations get really complicated. People find that it's not actually helpful, right? The King of England has multiple feudal relationships. A particular duke or bishop might have multiple relationships, right? Two people are fighting each other. I'm pulled in both ways. What do I do? The nature of warfare also begins to change. By the time you get to 1400, 1500, you're no longer talking about raising large armies just based on feudal kind of call-ups. We're not quite at standing armies like we would have in a modern sense, but we're moving in that direction. A lot of the fighting done during the 30 Years' War in 1618 to 1648 is done by professional armies, is done by soldiers whose vocation is being a soldier. They're kind of like mercenaries, basically. So feudalism, by the time we get to 1600, is a little bit different. lords are still wearing, heavy armor and things like that, although it tends to be more decorative. Right? They're no longer kind of like the knights on horseback that we're used to from the sort of classical medieval story. So by this point, the military side of feudalism has basically eroded or is going away. What remains, however, is that understanding of social relationships. The idea that because of who I am and who my parents are, I am born into a particular set of social obligations. If I am a peasant and I'm born in a village, I automatically owe and expect to owe service to my lord in exchange for using some of his or her land. If I am a noble, I automatically expect certain rights and obligations just because I was born a noble, just because I have a fon or a de in the middle of my name. So we're talking here about social relationships that are defined hereditarily. And that's the core of feudalism by the time we get to the early modern period. Third observation that we can make, that again is a tradition, it's something that's existed for a long time, is that we're talking here about a rural world. Today, most of you live in what we would call an urban world. Right? The majority of people in the United States, the majority of people in most countries around the world live in cities, in suburbs, or even in exurbs. But they are used to an urban landscape. They're used to lots of other people living next to them. And even if you live in a rural world, you're used to being able to move outside of that world. Right? You may be from a farm in South Dakota, but the idea that you're going to go to Chicago and see a Cubs game, or Minneapolis and see a Twins game, that doesn't seem so far-fetched. The idea that you might hop on a plane, go to New York City, go to Miami, go to Dallas, go to Los Angeles, right? That idea is not very strange. The idea that you grow up in rural Nebraska on a small Midwestern farm, but you're really into movies and you want to make it big in Hollywood, that's not such a crazy idea. So even if we still have people that live in rural areas, the boundaries between rural and urban look much different today than they did in this period. Back around 1600, most people live in small villages or even in individual farms. In a country like France that's relatively sophisticated, we're talking about more than 75% of the population living in these little villages, maybe even a small town or two. In a country like Russia or Sweden, we're talking about over 90% of the population living in rural areas. For the vast majority of people, when they think about economic activity, that economic activity is farming. That's what the vast majority of people are engaged in. Can I produce enough food to feed my family? There is not this sense of social rising among ordinary people that we're used to today. Right? I just mentioned that idea of, well, you're from a farm in Nebraska, but you want to become a Hollywood star one day, make it big time. That doesn't exist in this period, not in the way that we would think of it today. There's one country that's kind of a small exception to this. That's basically the modern-day Netherlands, which is already urbanized by this period. But again, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Most countries, England, Poland, actually the word Pol means field in Slavic, right? So the name of the country even kind of tells you something about the nature of Polish society around 1600. There are important towns like Krakow, Dansk or Danzig. But for the most part, the vast majority of Polish people or people living in the Polish lands are living on farms or in small villages. Okay, the last point I want to make about the traditions of this world is that it is also a religious world. Now, when I talk about religion, that question in the modern sense is again different from the way it would have been understood back in this period. When I ask you, are you religious? You go up on the street, you meet someone, you go on a date, you say, are you religious? That's a question that's usually about dogma, right? The question there is, do you believe in God? So you say, okay, well, yeah, you're talking to someone, they say, yes, okay, I believe in God. Okay, well, that's great. Are you Christian? Are you Jewish? Are you Muslim? Are you Hindu? Buddhist? Because we're talking here about dogma. We're talking about what are your specific religious beliefs. And so you're talking to someone and say, oh, okay, I'm a Christian. Oh, okay, that's great. You're a Christian. All right. Are you Catholic? Protestant? Eastern Orthodox? Are you Mormon? Well, okay, let's think. What do I believe? What do I think? Okay, you say, okay, I'm Protestant. Oh, okay, well, that's great. What kind of Protestant are you? Are you Lutheran? Are you Methodist? Anglican? Episcopalian? Are you part of a new kind of breakaway movement? Right, we can keep going on and drilling down. We're not even getting into the question of what is an evangelical Christian? What does that mean? Right, there's many layers, but they're all predicated on the question of what do you believe? What are your specific set of beliefs? That's not what we're actually talking about here when I say it's a religious world. It is a religious world in that sense, right? People do believe in God mostly. Very few atheists in this period. But when I'm saying it's a religious world, what I mean is that people do not imagine there to be a wide gap between the secular and the supernatural. The things that you do, the rituals that you engage in, the prayers that you say, the little offerings that you might make to a saint, those are not seen as questions of practicing devotion. Those are not seen necessarily as, okay, well, I need to do these things to make sure I get into heaven. They are presumed to have real life impact, real world impact. Right? If I say the rosary incorrectly, my crops might fail. If some woman curses me, that curse might cause me to not be able to have children. That curse might cause an accident to happen. The idea of the supernatural, angels and demons and things like that, affecting reality is something that is widely accepted. And this is really important because it means that those rituals are not just a question of, well, what do you feel like doing? Right? Here's the official version of what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to give up meat for Lent. But do people actually do it? Well, maybe, I don't know. Right? There isn't that sense of I have that latitude because the expectation is if I screw it up, it's going to affect my daily life. It's going to affect the real world. So trying to figure out what is St. John's Day is not just a kind of academic question. It's one that's seen with real world import. Trying to figure out whether or not the Eucharist transforms itself into the flesh of Christ or whether it's a metaphor is not just a kind of academic question, theological question, these guys sitting around in robes talking about it. It's a fundamentally important question for everybody living in early modern Europe. And that's one of the reasons that when the Reformation hits, it's not just, well, here's Luther debating with Calvin, debating with the Pope, and what are they saying? It is seen as something that is going to dramatically impact ordinary people. And this is one of the reasons that we see things like talismans, medallions, prayers, omens, charms. Obviously, those of you from New England, you're very familiar with the story of the Salem witchcraft trials. People in this period believe in it. People in this period talk about basilisks, not just as some kind of Dungeons and Dragon, Harry Potter type thing, but they believe those things are actually out there, and you need to protect yourself from them. Okay, so far we've been setting up this idea of Europe around 1700 as being a world of tradition, a world of stasis. But there are some very important ways that this European society is beginning to evolve, is beginning to change, right? There's some fundamental kind of earthquakes going on. And even if we can't see the long-term impacts just yet, the fact that they're happening is really critical. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some of these big changes going on. And probably the most important change that we can talk about is changing ideas about the relationship between man and nature. Now, again, we live in a world where this relationship is very different, right? We live in a world where, for the most part, people do stuff to nature, right? If you look at movies, if you think about popular culture, usually nature, Mother Earth, is the one that has to be protected from the big bad industrialists, from the big bad, humans that are tearing it up and destroying it. Right? Even if you think about like sci-fi, right? There's that great scene in Lord of the Rings where the wizard Sauron, who was a good guy, but now he's becoming a bad guy. And so he wants to generate this big, powerful army called the Uruk-hai. How does he do it? Oh, he tears down all the trees and he mines all the minerals from the earth. So we, in the modern world, in the 20th century, 21st century, for the most part, we imagine ourselves as kind of punching the defenseless nature. You could put an asterisk on this. I'm doing this podcast in 2021. We're dealing with COVID, right? COVID-19. Okay, nature still can affect us. We still have hurricanes. Some of you might say, well, let's talk about climate change. But for the most part, you're not worried about the temperature outside today because you have air conditioning or you have heating. You're not worried about whether or not you catch a cold because you have various ways to remedy that. You're not worried about walking down the street and some kind of wild beast is going to attack you because we basically killed all the wild beasts and put them in like zoos. So we live in a world where man really kind of controls nature for the most part. Before 1600, this is the opposite case. Nature dominates most people's lives. Nature forces people to take various actions, and a lot of their lives are kind of predicated around avoiding these kind of natural catastrophes. How can we avoid starvation? How can we avoid outbreaks of disease? So the approach to nature is different, right? Nature is not this passive thing that we do stuff to. Nature is this incredibly complicated, mysterious thing that does stuff to us. When people in this period, and even before, going back all the way to ancient Greece, when people in this period think about how do we know what we know about nature, the very way that they approach the topic, for the most part, is very different than what we would do today. In fact, people don't really even practice something that one would call science. They practice more what we would call natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is the idea that we sit around, we think about what nature should be, what we believe it to be, as opposed to conducting experiments to find out what it actually is. Right? Picture in your mind, I say, okay, like there's a group of philosophers, they're sitting around, what are they doing? Right? They're probably around a table, maybe they're drinking coffee. A couple years ago, 10, 20 years ago, they would have been chewing on their pipes maybe. They're sitting around, they're having these intense debates. Oh, this is the very essence of nature. It starts with this. But their activities are kind of all in their minds. And this is what natural philosophy was. It was predicated mainly on the idea of what we would call deductive logic. Deductive logic says, okay, I have these things that I know to be true. Knowing that, what else can I figure out? What other conclusions can I draw, having already accepted various truths or pieces of evidence? For example, what does the solar system look like? If we step back to a medieval mind and we say, how do we understand what the solar system is? They would say, well, okay, it starts with the Bible, right? And we know the Bible is true because God gave it to us. It's literally true. We want to think about things like planetary motion, which the Bible obviously doesn't talk about. We know that God created the world. We know that God is perfect. And so obviously the world then that God creates would be perfect. The shapes that these planets must be moving in must be the perfect shape, which is a circle. The order of the planets should conform to God's plan because God is perfect and God made the universe. So if you look at the Bible, the whole point of creation is not God's plan for Jupiter. It's not God's plan for asteroids. It's God's plan for humans. And so therefore, if humans are at the center of the plan of creation, the earth on which they live must also be the center of the universe. This is what I'm talking about when I refer to natural philosophy, which is using, again, this idea of deductive logic. In about the 16th century, Europeans start to develop a new approach to generating knowledge. This is called inductive logic. Instead of saying, what should the planetary motions be? How do we think that they operate? They begin to say, let's just collect data. Let's make observations on what the world looks like. And then once we have these observations, we can start to develop theories that then explain why something is the way that it is. And so basically this is the story. The first kind of example of this is the story of the discovery of planetary motion. We're talking about people like Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei. These are the pioneers of this new form of inductive logic. And if you'd like to hear more about this topic, about the specific thing that we call the scientific revolution, you can check that out on our Patreon level of specific podcasts. But again, basically, Europeans start changing the way that they think about nature. And one of the things they begin to discover is that nature has a lot of laws. Nature is not this mysterious, complicated, almost magical force out there. Nature is actually a machine. And if we use our powers of observation, we can begin to discover these hidden natural laws. We can begin to discover gravity. We can begin to discover planetary motion. We can begin to make nature predictable. Think about the human body. The human body is more or less a machine, a very complicated machine. We have to figure out all the various parts. Even now, today, we're down to like the molecular level. But the human body, it may not be only a machine, but a lot of it is a machine. And if we can understand how it works, then we can fix it. Then we can make it more powerful. Once you start to understand the nature of disease, the nature of viruses, the nature of cancer, then you can begin to develop ways to combat those issues. Once we begin to understand what makes plants grow, how we can combine plants to engineer them, to make them stronger, to make them faster, well, now we can begin to control nature. And that is radically different from what had existed before. Okay, another major kind of change that we see going on during this period is related to the way that Europeans view not just their relationship to the natural world, but their relationship to other humans as well. Prior to this period, Europeans basically spend most of their time, shockingly enough, in Europe. Europeans are aware that there are these people that live kind of on the steppes of Russia. There are these people that live in the Middle East. There are these people that live in the northern parts of Africa. And those people look slightly different than Europeans. Those people's cultural traditions and social traditions are slightly different than Europeans. But it's not radically different. Someone from Greece can go to Turkey, can go to Baghdad, and say, actually, I understand a lot of what's going on. Islam and Christianity, very different in some ways, but they're both monotheistic religions. They both look back on Judaism as kind of a precursor or a prelude to their own modifications. They both have similar rules about hygiene, etiquette, morality. They might have slight differences, but they're very comprehensible to each other because they're very similar. Starting in the late 14th, early 15th century, Europeans begin to explore beyond their immediate neighbors. The Portuguese sail south and get around Africa. They start to find sub-Saharan Africa. You have travelers like Marco Polo that start to go overland to China, India. And of course, Columbus famously lands in the New World, creates this kind of encounter, comes back, says, wow, look at these people, they're very different. So European ideas about their own place in the world and what humanity looks like and cultural differences, all of these things begin to change in very dramatic ways. And of course, I just mentioned Columbus, and I think today one of the kind of initial thoughts most people have when they say, okay, we're going to talk about Christopher Columbus, you immediately jump into power relations. Right, here come the Europeans, they're going to conquer everybody, they're going to create imperialism. And of course, there is some truth to that, especially with Columbus and his exploitation of Native Americans. But it's beginning a story in the middle where Europeans begin to amass power. It's worth noting in the previous 1,000 years, during the medieval period, Europe is not the place that is invading others. Europe is not the place of power. Quite the opposite, Europe is the place that is getting invaded. If we wanted to compile a list of who some of these peoples are, it's a long list. We could go back to the sort of end of the Roman Empire. We could talk about Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Lombards, Avars, Slavs, Angles, Saxons, Vikings, Muslims, Mongols. Wave after wave, century after century, Europe is the place that gets invaded. So how does this change? Why does it change? There are two major developments that kind of begin to change this story. And the first that most historians point to is gunpowder. which is kind of interesting because Europeans do not invent gunpowder. The Chinese are the ones that first pick it up. The Chinese and the Turks, I believe, first begin to weaponize it, to say, okay, let's put it in a cannon. But it's the Europeans that benefit from it. And the reason for that is that Europeans are able to start using metallurgy, right? They're able to start doing these experiments, using that inductive logic, finding some of those hidden rules, and they realize how to make a stronger form of cannon. The stronger the cannon is, the metal of the cannon, the stronger the blast is that you can fire off. And so it's really developing cannons more than it's developing muskets that makes a big difference. Now, a second part of this is related to the idea of being able to sail into the wind. Europeans also begin to learn how to sail into the wind, and so they build these massive sailing ships that you can put your cannons on. And so if you're thinking about military tactics and military strategy, one of the big changes that happens is that Europeans basically have these mobile artillery platforms that they can shoot and move around the battlefield, whereas their adversaries, especially in Asia and Africa, do not have that same ability. So you show up with your little fleet, you shoot, you move, the enemy can't get you back. Perfect example of this is the Battle of Diu, D-I-U, in 1509, where you have this mighty Ottoman fleet, which is allied with the mighty Venetian fleet. We're talking about over 100 ships, and they confront the little Portuguese navy, which has about 17 ships and 800 men. And on the surface, you'd say, wow, 100 to 17, Portugal's in for a lot of pain here. But the Portuguese have cannons and they have sailing ships. The Ottomans and the Venetians are still using old school galleys. Galleys are ships that have to be rowed by hand. Galleys don't carry lots of cannons. Galleys try to ram you or try to board you. And so that small group of 17 ships actually routs the much larger Ottoman and Venetian fleets. It basically opens up the Indian Ocean to trade for Europeans. And the British, the French, and the Portuguese, and to some extent the Dutch, become involved in this extremely lucrative trade because militarily they've been able to push the Venetians and the Ottomans out of the picture. There's another aspect to this story relating to the size of standing armies and the state. If you're interested in that topic, we will cover it in a separate episode on the military revolution, which again will be available via that Patreon subscription service. Okay, the last major thing that I want to talk about are changes to daily life, right? We as historians, we often get caught up in these big questions about politics, about economics. Traditionally, the history of warfare was one of the dominant fields of historical inquiry. Why does World War I happen? Why does the South, why are they able to fight off the North for so long? Right? Was it that the Northern generals were just incompetent? Was it because the Southern way of fighting was more effective? How do the Americans win the American Revolution, right? Wasn't Britain this big, strong mother country, this imperial power? But we shouldn't forget daily life. We shouldn't forget the story of the little guy and the way that things are changing in this period, even for most ordinary people. One of the best ways that we can see this is actually with changes to diet, to food, that happens as a result of something called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is basically the result of Columbus's encounter with the New World. Columbus shows up, and of course his first thought is gold. I want gold, gold, silver, give me precious metals, I got to take it back. He also thinks he's in China, and he's on the lookout for some spices that aren't there. But eventually the key to New World wealth becomes things like sugar, things like tobacco, various products and goods that can be taken from the New World and brought back to the Old World. And at the same time, Columbus brings new things to the Native Americans. Europeans bring new technologies, they bring horses, they bring guns. Most importantly, they bring smallpox, unfortunately. It's definitely not an even trade that goes on. But some of those products come back to Europe and fundamentally begin to change European society. And I'm a bit of a foodie, so just to help you kind of get this, I have a food example. If I said it's late night, you're hungry, if you're a student, you've been studying all night. If you're an adult, maybe you've been working all day, you're hungry, you want to go out, you want to order in. You say, I'm in the mood for Italian food. What are you going to order? What are some typical Italian foods you'd get at a nice Italian restaurant? You can go with the basic spaghetti and meatballs. Are you a ravioli person? Pizza, of course. If you're going to watch the Super Bowl, I think that's the biggest night for pizza deliveries. Pizza, incidentally, is not Italian. It's based off of an Italian dish that Italian immigrants bring to the United States, and then they rework it into pizza. But we tend to think of pizza as being a typical Italian dish. Of course, if any of you are big Garfield fans, if you remember the cartoon Garfield, right? What's Garfield's favorite food? Lasagna. Delicious lasagna, right? If you were alive before 1600, you never would have heard of any of these foods because all of these foods require tomatoes. And the tomato was not native to Europe. It was native to South and Central America. It does not exist in Italy before 1600. Think about that for a moment. Think about what Italian cuisine would look like with no tomatoes, with no spaghetti sauce, no red sauce. Think about how radically the introduction of the tomato changed Italian culture. Right? Today, you think about spaghetti and meatballs as sort of like core Italian dish. Right? If you've ever seen The Godfather, it's kind of the story of these mafia guys. There's this one great scene where they're kind of hiding out and some of the kind of more, the guys that are kind of lower on the mafia scale, they're all kind of hiding out. And this guy's like in his wife beater or his A-shirt, and he's making this giant pot of spaghetti. And he's like, I'm going to tell you how to make the spaghetti. That scene can't exist without the Columbian Exchange. I've got another example for you. How many of you out there have Irish heritage? I'm broadcasting here from the United States. A lot of Irish Americans here in the United States. When do most of them come over? Well, they come in the 1840s as a result of a blight that wipes out this large portions of potato crop. This blight is so bad, over 1 million Irishmen and women die. 2 million other Irishmen and women and children will say, things are so bad here, we have to leave our homeland. Can you imagine any circumstance that would make you want to leave the country that you live in today? Okay, war, obviously, that might be one thing. But can you imagine there being such a shortage of food or toilet paper or gasoline or something where you go, I'm just going to give up on the country that I was born in, that my ancestors have lived in for hundreds of years. I'm done with it. Right? That's the decision to immigrate is not one that is taken lightly. It's not one where they just say like, I wish I had more economic opportunity. I have a job, but I wish I made more money. This is a big deal. So 2 million people leave Ireland because of the failure of a single crop. Guess what? The potato is not native to Ireland. Potatoes basically come from the Andes Mountains, from the Incas. And they're brought back to Europe and they say, wow, we've got this thing full of starch. Europeans, everybody needs starch to survive. We need calories. Potatoes love to live in kind of wet climate. It can be a little bit cold out. Perfect for Ireland. It's the perfect food for Ireland. But again, had the Columbian Exchange never happened, you would never have the potato blight. You would never have these large numbers of Irish Americans or Irish in other parts of the world like you do today. So the Columbian Exchange is not just about saying, now we have some chocolate, we have some tea, life is just a little bit better. It's nice to have this little kind of creature comfort or treat. The Columbian Exchange changes life in fundamental and very important ways. Okay, we're going to wrap up our show by just making this kind of basic observation again, repeating that Europe around 1700 is really a society in the midst of incredible and systematic change. And we'll explore this notion of change and daily life in a bit more specific way during our next podcast episode, A Portrait of Europe, the Peasants. Basically, we're going to look at what life was like for ordinary people living in all of those small villages and farms. Just as a teaser, I'll tell you, those people never really go more than 5 to 10 miles from the place that they're born. And so we'll talk about the consequences, the effects. We'll talk about what that sort of mentality looks like for ordinary people. Again, as I said in our next podcast episode. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe to History Off the Page on the streaming service of your choice. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter Our Twitter handle is @HistoryOTP. We'd love to hear from you, love to interact with you, get feedback about the episode. So please like, share, and subscribe to us. We hope to see you next time as we take history off the page.